There was a time, not so long ago, when families living deep in the Appalachian Mountains survived winters so brutal that modern homes, with all their insulation, their digital thermostats, their double-paned windows and sealed ductwork, would have failed them completely. Not because those modern homes aren't warm, but because they depend on systems, on electricity, on gas lines and compressors and circuit breakers that can fail in a storm. Appalachian families depended on something else entirely. They depended on knowledge, and that knowledge, built over generations, kept them comfortable in conditions that would leave most of us helpless today. If you watch this channel on television and want to help it reach more people, the most important thing you can do is share this video with someone who would enjoy it. Subscriptions help the channel grow, and every one of them matters. But sharing is what truly carries these stories forward. Stand in the right place on a winter morning in the Blue Ridge, and you will understand something immediately. The cold here is not the kind that just makes you shiver. It is the kind that settles into the bones of the land itself. The ridges disappear into low gray clouds. The hollows fill with mist that doesn't burn off until midday, if it burns off at all. Ice forms on the inside of window frames. Frost flowers bloom across wooden floors where cold air seeps in through the baseboards. The silence is so complete that you can hear the fire crackle from 3 rooms away. It is a place of profound beauty and of profound difficulty. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was home to tens of thousands of families who had almost nothing except their hands, their land, and the accumulated wisdom of the people who had lived here before them. The Appalachian Mountains stretch from Alabama to Maine. But the heart of what most people mean when they say Appalachia lies in the territory cutting through western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, southwest Virginia, and the highlands of Kentucky and West Virginia. These were places European settlers reached relatively late, following the Scots-Irish immigrants who pushed through the mountain gaps in the mid-1700s, establishing homesteads in the creek bottoms and ridge lines that no one else particularly wanted. The land was gorgeous and largely impossible. Farms had to be carved from steep hillsides, gardens perched on narrow benches of flat ground above roaring rivers, and the winters arrived fast and stayed long and gave very little warning before turning catastrophic. In documented accounts from the late 18th century, travelers who crossed the Appalachians in winter described conditions that modern readers find difficult to believe. Bishop August Gottlieb Spangenberg, who traveled through the North Carolina highlands in 1752, scouting land for a Moravian settlement, wrote in his diary of nights so cold that the ink in his pen froze solid, of trails obliterated overnight by snowfall that came without warning, of isolated farms so cut off from any neighbor that a family could go weeks without seeing another human being. Frederick Law Olmsted, who traveled through Appalachia in the 1850s, described mountain cabins where the gaps between logs were wide enough to see daylight through them, and where families nonetheless managed to stay alive, and in many cases comfortable, through the full depth of winter. That paradox, surviving, even thriving, in conditions that seem impossible by modern standards, is what this story is really about. Not tools for their own sake. Not a list of survival tricks, but the deeper intelligence behind how these families thought about warmth, about shelter, about the relationship between a human body and the cold world outside. What they understood was not simple. It was a remarkably sophisticated grasp of thermal behavior, arrived at entirely through observation and necessity, without a single engineering textbook. To understand what made Appalachian homes work, you first have to understand what made them vulnerable. The earliest cabins in the mountain settlements were built fast, by necessity. A family arriving in the fall had only weeks before the first hard frost, and the priority was shelter over perfection. Logs were notched and stacked horizontally, the corners locked together in joint styles that settlers had carried over from European tradition. The basic structure could go up in days if neighbors helped, and helping was expected. A man who would not help raise a neighbor's cabin in autumn could not expect help in spring. But the gaps between those logs were enormous. Green wood shrinks as it dries. Logs that fit tightly in September left cracks wide enough to push a finger through by December. Wind came through those gaps in the night like something alive, cold and relentless, finding every unprotected surface. The solution was chinking and daubing, one of the oldest building techniques in human history, and in Appalachia, elevated to a genuine craft. Chinking was the material packed into the gaps between logs to seal them against drafts, wind, and vermin. Daubing was the outer layer applied over the chinking to finish the seal. What families used for both depended entirely on what was locally available. The most common chinking in the southern Appalachians was a mixture of mud and clay, sometimes mixed with straw or dried grasses to add strength and prevent cracking. Moss was gathered from the forest floor and packed into gaps, especially at higher elevations where certain mosses grew dense and thick enough to create a surprisingly effective windbreak. In some cabins, particularly in areas where livestock were common, dried animal dung mixed with clay created a wall plaster that was more durable than plain mud and far better at resisting moisture. The outer daubing was not just applied once and forgotten, it was maintained. Women and men both understood that daubing cracked over winter as logs expanded and contracted with temperature changes, and that a wall sealed in October could be riddled with small fissures by January. Checking and redaubing the walls of a cabin was a regular autumn task, as dependable as putting up the garden or laying in the firewood. A family that neglected their daubing paid for it all winter in drafts and cold floors, and the exhausting inefficiency of trying to heat a space quietly leaking warmth through 100 small cracks. The firewood itself deserves its own conversation, because the preparation of firewood in the Appalachian tradition was a science as much as a chore. A single winter in a mountain cabin could consume 10 to 20 cords of wood, a cord being a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. Families spent the warmer months in an almost continuous cycle of identifying, felling, splitting, and stacking wood, and the choices they made about which wood to cut mattered enormously. Oak and hickory were prized for their density and their long, slow burn. A hickory fire banked properly in the evening would still be throwing heat from coals in the early morning hours. Chestnut, before the blight of the early 20th century eliminated it from Appalachian forests almost completely, was another highly valued wood. Quick to catch, burning hot and clean, useful for starting a fire in a cold hearth on a bitter morning when speed mattered. What most people don't realize is that the way wood was stacked for drying, what woodsmen called seasoning, was as important as the species. Green wood, freshly cut, contains so much moisture that it releases most of its energy as steam rather than heat. Burning green wood is an almost comically inefficient way to heat a home, producing thick smoke, coating the chimney with creosote, and delivering a fraction of the warmth that properly dried wood provides. Experienced Appalachian families knew that wood needed at least a full year of outdoor drying to burn well, ideally 2 years for the densest hardwoods, and so they were always working years ahead of themselves. The wood you split this summer kept you warm the winter after next. That kind of long-horizon thinking, planning in years rather than weeks, was fundamental to how these families survived. The stone fireplace was the gravitational center of household life in the oldest cabins. Stones for these fireplaces were gathered from nearby creek beds, where the action of moving water had sorted them by size and smoothed their surfaces. Creek stone has a property that mountain families understood intuitively. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. A fireplace built from dense creek stone continued radiating warmth for hours after the fire itself had burned down to coals. This is the principle of thermal mass, as real and useful in 1780 as in any passive solar building designed today. The positioning of the fireplace within the cabin was deliberate. In many traditional Appalachian structures, the fireplace was built into an interior wall rather than an exterior one, so that the heat stored in the stone radiated inward rather than being lost through the outside wall. Chimneys were often massive, far larger than modern builders would consider necessary, because the mass of the chimney itself became a heat reservoir, slowly releasing warmth into adjacent rooms long after the fire had been reduced for the night. Older men in the community knew, from a lifetime of experience, that the size of a chimney was not about aesthetics. It was about how many hours of comfort you could extract from a single evening's fire. Cast iron stoves, which began arriving in mountain communities in significant numbers by the mid-1800s, added a new dimension to thermal management. A wood stove works differently from an open fireplace. The fire is contained, the draw is controlled, and the iron body of the stove itself becomes a radiating surface that throws heat in all directions simultaneously. Families learn to bank a wood stove in the evening, packing the firebox with dense hardwood, closing the draft to slow the burn, so that it would still be producing warmth 8 or 10 hours later when the household woke in the pre-dawn darkness. The cast iron pot on top of the stove kept water warm through the night, so that the first task of the morning was not starting a fire from scratch in a completely cold house, but simply opening the draft on a stove that was already alive. But heat from fire was only one element of how Appalachian families managed comfort. Perhaps more important was what they did with the spaces they were trying to heat. Modern homes are designed to maintain a uniform temperature throughout. The same warmth in the bedroom as in the kitchen, in the hallway as in the living room. This is a relatively recent expectation, born of abundant cheap energy and mechanical systems. In the Appalachian tradition, warmth was zoned by necessity and by wisdom. The main room, where the hearth or stove lived, was the warm room. Every other room was a separate thermal reality. Bedroom doors were kept closed. Interior walls, even uninsulated ones, created a meaningful separation between heated and unheated spaces. By containing their heat to 1 or 2 rooms and blocking the rest of the house from communicating with those rooms, families reduced the volume of air they had to keep warm by half or more. This meant their wood supply went proportionally farther, and their fire maintained a higher temperature in the spaces they actually occupied. It was thermal zoning, the same principle that modern smart home systems attempt to replicate with programmable controls and zone dampers, executed through nothing more sophisticated than a well-fitted door and the discipline to keep it closed. This understanding of space extended to how beds were managed. In the coldest weeks of a mountain winter, sleeping in an unheated bedroom required strategies that modern people would find remarkable. Quilts were the primary solution, and in Appalachia, the making of quilts was not a hobby or a craft project. It was a life or death necessity. Families in cabins without insulation needed warm bed covering, and they needed a great deal of it. Quilts were made from whatever fabric was available. Worn-out clothing, flour sacks, remnants of wool and cotton and flannel pieced together in whatever combination produced the most warmth. The batting inside was often wool carding waste or raw cotton, both of which trap air between fibers and create the insulating layer that makes the difference between sleeping warm and shivering through the night. Beds in winter were commonly piled with 4, 5, or even 6 quilts. This detail appears in multiple accounts of 19th century Appalachian life, and the weight was not incidental. Heavy bedding prevented the cold air convection currents that develop around a sleeping body when the covering is loose. The Scots, Irish, and German settlers who arrived in the mountains in the 18th century had already developed the quilting tradition in their home countries, and in Appalachia, it merged with whatever local materials and local ingenuity could add to it. Women gathered for quilting bees in the autumn, bringing needles and thread and fabric scraps, spending hours together stitching by firelight. These were not merely social occasions. They were the mechanism through which a community produced the thermal infrastructure that kept families alive through winter. The problem with piled quilts, of course, was getting into bed in the first place. A bedroom closed off all day in a mountain winter was not merely cool, it was cold enough to see your breath. Climbing into cold sheets and waiting for body heat to slowly warm the bedding was both unpleasant and genuinely inefficient. The solution Appalachian families used had been employed in some form since the medieval period. Bed warming. Flat stones or bricks were placed near the fire an hour or 2 before bedtime, allowed to absorb as much heat as possible, then wrapped in thick cloth and carried to the bed, slid under the covers down toward the foot where the bedding was coldest. Soapstone, found naturally in seams running through parts of the Appalachian mountain chain, was particularly prized for this purpose. Soapstone has an unusually high heat capacity for a rock. It absorbs and stores a large amount of thermal energy per unit of weight. and releases that heat slowly and evenly, without the rapid cooling that makes ordinary stones less effective. Mountain families who had access to soapstone deposits understood its properties from long use, even if they could not have named the physics. A soapstone wrapped in flannel and placed at the foot of the bed could maintain warmth for 3 or 4 hours, long enough for the body heat of the sleeper to take over. Copper or brass warming pans, shallow-lidded pans on long handles filled with hot coals and moved between the sheets, served the same purpose in households wealthy enough to own them. Though in the mountains the simple heated stone was far more common, but warmth in the bedroom was only the end of a much longer chain that began the previous summer. The root cellar, dug into the hillside adjacent to the cabin or beneath the cabin floor itself, was primarily a food preservation system. But its role in winter comfort was profound. At a depth of 6 to 10 feet, the ground temperature in the Appalachian highlands remains remarkably stable year-round, hovering between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the air above is doing. Families stored their potatoes, turnips, cabbage, dried beans, cured meat, preserved fruit, and fermented vegetables there. And this supply was not simply food. It was the metabolic fuel that kept their bodies generating the internal heat they needed to stay warm. The connection between diet and thermal comfort was one these families understood through lived experience. The winter diet shifted markedly. Fat content went up. Lard, rendered from hogs slaughtered in November, became a cooking staple and a caloric necessity. Beans and cornbread provided slow-burning energy that sustained body temperature through long, cold nights. The smokehouse connected to this same thermal logic. Hogs were slaughtered in the first hard freeze of late November or early December, when the outside air was cold enough to prevent spoilage during the initial curing process. The meat was packed in salt and then slowly smoked over a low, controlled fire of hickory or apple wood for days at a time. A well-cured ham from November could still be eaten safely the following summer, with no refrigeration of any kind required. This was not a trick or a shortcut. It was an entire preservation science, developed through centuries of trial and observation, requiring precise knowledge of temperature, humidity, and time. Families also built spring houses, small stone structures positioned directly over or adjacent to a cold freshwater spring, designed to use the constant low temperature of emerging water to keep perishables cool. The water flowing through a spring house remained between 40 and 50 degrees year-round, cold enough to slow bacterial growth significantly. Milk, butter, eggs, and cheese were stored on stone shelves above the flowing water, and the structure itself was kept cool by the evaporation and the thermal mass of the stone walls. It was, in every functional sense, a refrigerator, one that required no electricity, no mechanical compressor, no power grid, and essentially no maintenance beyond keeping the structure clear of debris. The knowledge of how to build a spring house, how to site it relative to the spring and the prevailing winds, how to construct the stone walls thick enough to buffer temperature fluctuations. This was practical engineering passed from person to person through observation and direct experience. It was not written down. It existed in hands and eyes and memory. None of these systems worked in isolation. The daubed walls held the heat the fire produced. The firewood, properly seasoned, made the fire efficient. The thermal mass of the stone hearth extended that heat through the night. The closed bedroom door made it possible to maintain warmth in the main room without burning double the wood. The quilts made the cold bedroom survivable. The bedstone made climbing into that cold bed bearable. The root cellar and the smokehouse kept the food supply intact through winter, ensuring that the bodies living in that cabin had the calories they needed to stay warm from the inside. Pull any one element out of that chain, and the others became harder to manage. It was a system, as integrated and interdependent as any modern HVAC installation, and considerably more resilient. Today, the knowledge that built and maintained these systems has nearly vanished. Not all at once, and not without reason. Modern heating is genuinely better in many ways, more comfortable, less labor-intensive, more reliable under normal conditions. But it is also profoundly fragile in ways that Appalachian mountain families would have found alarming. A winter storm that interrupts the power grid for 3 days transforms a modern house into something frighteningly cold. The systems that provide modern comfort are just that, systems, and systems fail. An Appalachian family of the 19th century, living in objectively more difficult conditions, was not helpless when the storm came. They had already accounted for it. Their entire way of life was a preparation for exactly that contingency. What we have inherited from those families is not their technology. Most of it is gone, replaced by better and worse in equal measure. What we have inherited, if we choose to claim it, is the underlying intelligence. The understanding that comfort is not a condition you purchase. It is a condition you build, maintain, and share with your neighbors, with your community, with the next generation of people who will live in these mountains after you. Somewhere in the southern Appalachians, on a cold morning in early January, the old cabins that still stand are doing what they have always done, holding the cold at a distance, remembering, in the grain of their hewn logs and the remains of their stone hearths, what it once meant to understand warmth from the inside out. That knowledge was hard-won. It deserves to be remembered.